He was the kind of man who never apologized. Until the day he broke, William Hawthorne built an empire with steel in his voice and ice in his veins. By 46, he had everything: power, wealth, control. But none of it kept his wife from walking away. None of it stopped the silence from echoing through his penthouse at night. Then, one day, he publicly humiliated his new secretary. And instead of breaking down, she looked him in the eye and said something that shattered the armor he'd spent decades building. If you had everything, but still felt nothing. If you ruled the room, but were alone in everyone. If someone quietly reminded you that you still had a heart, what would you do? This is not just a story about success. It's about the courage to start again, the quiet power of kindness, and the love that finds us when we finally stop hiding. If this story touches something in you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's go back to the 38th floor, where the coldest room in Boston was about to warm. There are offices where people feel inspired. And then, there's the 38th floor of Hawthorne Group, where people held their breath when William Hawthorne walked by. Each Monday morning, the hum of productivity was carefully orchestrated by fear. Desks were arranged just so. Coffee mugs sat on coasters, papers stacked with geometric precision. Conversations were muted, glances brief, and no one ever took the elevator to the 38th floor unless absolutely necessary. That floor belonged to him. William Hawthorne didn't walk. He strode, like someone who had inherited the world and decided it wasn't quite up to standard. At 46, he'd rebuilt his late father's real estate empire from the ashes of bankruptcy and scandal. He had done it with a single-mindedness that left no room for mistakes and even less for emotion. His suits were dark, tailored, always buttoned. His eyes were the kind of cold that made people rethink casual greetings. But no one could deny he was brilliant, ruthlessly efficient, exacting, and terrifying. This Monday was no exception. The elevator doors slid open at precisely 7:55 a.m., and William stepped into the hallway. His shoes clicked crisply on the marble floor. People straightened their backs. Monitors lit up as though summoned by fear. Even the janitor quietly wheeled his cart away without finishing the glass panels. The boardroom was already full when William entered at 8:00 sharp. 20 department heads sat stiffly in their chairs, hands folded, eyes forward. He placed his leather briefcase on the table, opened a folder, and glanced around with the calm of a surgeon about to make an incision. Let's begin. Reports were passed around. Budgets reviewed. Metrics dissected. No one spoke unless spoken to. Then came the inevitable moment. "Marketing," William said, barely glancing up. "Explain this underperformance in Q4 leads." A senior manager, Robert, cleared his throat. "We've seen a slight dip due to regional delays, but we have a new strategy for Q1. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. If I wanted excuses, I would have asked for them. I want results. The silence was immediate and absolute. Robert lowered his gaze. The room felt 10 degrees colder. From her spot near the door, Grace Sullivan made a note in her planner. She had been working at Hawthorne Group for just under 2 months. At 34, Grace was unassuming in the way that made people underestimate her. Brown hair always tied back. Clothes modest, neat, no makeup. Her demeanor was calm, deliberate, professional. She never spoke more than necessary, never lingered in conversation, never seemed flustered. It was part of what made her so good at her job, and yet, something about her hadn't escaped William's attention. Not yet defined, not yet voiced, but noticed. She was precise, efficient. But there was a stillness about her, too, as if she were always listening, even when no one was speaking. And then it happened. William reached for the next folder in his stack, the one Grace was supposed to update over the weekend, and paused. "This data is from last month," he said flatly. "We discussed these corrections on Friday." Grace, standing beside him, blinked once. "I sent the revision draft Sunday morning. You requested a printed copy." "This," William said, holding up the outdated document, "is not the revision." He turned slightly toward her. The room watched in dreadful silence. "In the future," he said coldly, "if you're going to take initiative, make sure it's the right one. Otherwise, don't waste anyone's time." The remark cut through the air like ice breaking underfoot. There it was, his signature brand of humiliation. Not cruel, exactly, just sharp enough to draw blood without leaving a wound. Everyone looked at Grace, waiting, expecting her to shrink, but she didn't. She met his gaze not with defiance, but with a calm that unnerved even the onlookers. "I don't mind being corrected," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'd prefer it not be done at the expense of my dignity." You could have heard a pin drop. William didn't blink. His jaw tightened. Around the table, eyes darted downward. Several employees stopped breathing. Grace didn't say more. She didn't need to. She simply placed the correct file on the table beside him and resumed her spot without drama or delay. William stared at the document. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not anger. Something quieter. Discomfort. Disruption. A mirror, perhaps, held up without malice, but with startling accuracy. The meeting resumed, but the temperature in the room had shifted. William didn't speak to Grace again that morning. Not because he was angry, but because he wasn't quite sure what to say. And as he watched her quietly exit the room, leather folder in hand, one thought stayed with him. This one. She's different. Some people scream, others stay silent, and that silence can be louder than any voice. William Hawthorne had faced competitors in courtrooms, sharks in boardrooms, and storms in the press. But nothing unsettled him more than a single sentence spoken in a soft voice by a woman who refused to flinch. "I don't mind being corrected, but I'd prefer it not be done at the expense of my dignity." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. Calm, measured, not accusing, not emotional, just true and unshakable. That sentence followed him out of the boardroom into his office, through 3 phone calls and a lunch he didn't touch. By evening, when the sky outside had faded into a wash of steel gray and Boston's lights began to twinkle along the river, the sentence still echoed in his mind. Grace Sullivan hadn't stormed out, hadn't sulked. She had quietly returned to her desk and continued working as if nothing had happened. That unsettled him even more. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the faint reflection in his office window. Somewhere behind the glass and years of armor, there was still a boy, one who remembered what it felt like to be embarrassed in front of others. A boy who had once stood silently in a school hallway, his mother's voice echoing behind him as she walked away for the last time. "You'll understand someday," she had said. "I just can't stay." He had waited 3 hours before realizing she was never coming back. His father didn't comfort him, didn't explain, just tossed a jacket at him and said, "Don't cry. It makes you weak." That was the first lesson William ever learned about emotion. The second came years later, in a downtown apartment with white walls and the smell of bergamot. His ex-wife had packed her things in silence. No tears, no yelling. Just a note left on the kitchen counter I needed more than a partner in business. He had built walls since then, high ones, cold ones, walls that kept people out and pain in. Until yesterday, until Grace. There was something in the way she carried herself, not proud, not submissive, just still, like someone who had learned to weather storms by not resisting them. In the days that followed, he watched her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of quiet curiosity. She arrived every morning 5 minutes early, never late, never rushed. She greeted the receptionist with a nod, never small talk. She never wore perfume, but there was always a faint scent of chamomile around her. Her desk was organized without being obsessive. Her emails were brief but polite. She labeled files with clarity, updated meeting notes promptly, and always seemed to know when he needed something before he asked. But it wasn't her efficiency that lingered with him. It was the details. A sticky note reminding him of his mother's birthday, though he hadn't spoken to her in years. A change in the color of the highlighter she used, always light blue, when reviewing negative financial trends, as if to soften the blow. A post-it on his desk that simply said, "Your 3 p.m. call was pushed to 3:30. You might have time to breathe." That one made him stop. Time to breathe. He hadn't thought about breathing in years, not consciously, anyway. The building moved around them each day in its usual rhythm, phones ringing, meetings, proposals. But every so often, Grace would leave behind some small human trace that reminded him he wasn't a machine. Then came Thursday evening. He had stayed late, as he often did, reviewing financial projections, reworking timelines, stewing silently over the lingering friction with the board. When he finally looked up, it was past 8:00 p.m. His office was dim, the city beyond the windows glowing in fractured lines of amber and red. He stood to stretch, and that's when he saw it. A small porcelain mug sat on the edge of his desk. Steam still rose gently from it. Next to it, a folded note in neat handwriting, chamomile. Helps the nerves. You've earned a few quiet minutes. G.S. He picked it up, held it in both hands. It was warm, and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, so was something inside him. But instead of feeling grateful, William felt conflicted. Kindness, especially unsolicited, made him uneasy. It was unpredictable, vulnerable. Worse than that, it required response. He didn't want to owe anyone anything, especially not the one person who had seen through him without trying. He stood there, mug in hand, heart thudding in a strange rhythm. Part of him wanted to thank her. Another part wanted to ignore it entirely, pretend it hadn't affected him. But neither felt right. He didn't sleep much that night, and when he arrived the next morning, the mug was washed and back in the break room. Grace was already at her desk, typing quietly, her face calm as always. She never mentioned the tea, and neither did he. But from that day forward, he began watching her a little more closely, not out of curiosity anymore, out of recognition. Because while her eyes were steady and her posture confident, there was something in the way she sometimes looked out the window. That told him she, too, was hiding a sadness no one ever asked about. Even the hardest armor has seams. You just need to know where to look. The boardroom was unusually tense that Thursday morning, not in the typical corporate polite way. There was a different energy in the air, one that came from unspoken doubts and carefully measured glances. The quarterly review meeting had just begun, and all 10 members of the Hawthorne Group's executive board were seated, including William's sister, Lydia, whose presence always added a hint of winter, even in spring. William stood at the head of the table, hands clasped loosely behind his back, voice steady as he presented projections, investment risks, and expansion strategies for the coming fiscal year. No one interrupted. No one ever did until Peter Lang cleared his throat. "I'd like to raise a concern," he said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. William tilted his head slightly, giving him permission to continue. Peter's tone was neutral, but the message wasn't. "I've noticed that your new assistant has been attending high-level internal briefings and accessing sensitive documents. Ms. Sullivan's background, while professional, doesn't necessarily align with the strategic roles she's been edging into. Perhaps we need to revisit protocol about who has access to what." There it was, delivered with a smile and wrapped in bureaucracy. But it was a jab, a quiet attack aimed not at Grace's competence, but her right to exist in spaces men like Peter considered sacred. William felt a flicker of something deep and sharp. "She's my executive assistant," he replied evenly. "I trust her judgment, and I asked her to be present." That last part wasn't entirely true, not in words, anyway, but she had shown up on time, prepared, always attentive. He had never needed to invite her twice. Peter leaned back, a tight smile on his face. "Of course, just wanted to ensure we're all aligned." Across the table, Lydia raised an eyebrow and looked at William with that older sister expression that said more than words ever could. Ever. After the meeting, she approached him in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "You trust her," she said flatly. "That's new." William didn't look at her. "She's efficient," Lydia smirked. "And you're not letting anything cloud your judgment, I assume." He paused, hand on the conference room door. "I never do." Lydia's voice was cool. "Just don't forget who you are, William, or what this company needs you to be." He didn't answer, but as he returned to his office, something in him stirred. He had always known Lydia meant well in her own hard-edged way. She had carried part of the company's burden since their father passed, but she had never believed in softness, and he had adopted that same creed long ago. Until Grace. That evening, the building emptied out slowly as snow began to fall outside, the kind of snow that didn't stick yet, but softened the edges of the city in gentle white hushes. William remained in his office, going over merger documents for the Chicago project, his eyes strained from the backlight. The silence had settled in, but not uncomfortably. A soft knock at the door broke his focus. Grace stood there, a file in her hand. "You asked for the updated proposal on the zoning approvals." He nodded, waving her in. She placed the folder on his desk and hesitated. "You've been here all day," she said. He glanced at the clock. "So have you." She smiled slightly. "Difference is, I had chamomile." William chuckled, just under his breath. "I thought we weren't speaking about tea." Grace shrugged. "It speaks for itself." He sat back, watching her. "Have a seat." She blinked, a little surprised, then pulled the chair across from his desk. Neither of them spoke right away. The room was dim, lit only by the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Boston looked quiet from above, snowflakes dancing in the glow of traffic. William cleared his throat. Peter was out of line today. "I'm used to men like him," Grace said simply. "They don't bother me as much as they used to." "Still," he said, "you didn't deserve that." She looked at him, then down at her hands. "I used to believe if you worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, you'd be left alone. But the world doesn't reward silence. Not really." William tilted his head. "You don't strike me as someone who stays silent." "Not anymore," she said. There was a pause. Then, with a calmness that felt earned, she added, "I was a therapist. Before this." He blinked. That explained a lot. "Why'd you leave?" Grace looked out the window for a moment, then back at him. I stopped believing I was helping. People would come, spill their pain, and I'd offer techniques, strategies, soft encouragement, but nothing changed. At least, not enough. One day I realized I was carrying too many stories I couldn't fix. He was quiet, she went on. So I took a job where I didn't have to listen, where no one expected me to carry their weight. And yet, William said softly, "You still do." Grace smiled sadly. It's hard to unlearn who you are. William understood that more than she knew. He leaned back in his chair, eyes meeting hers not as a CEO and assistant, but as two people who had both tried to escape something inside themselves. "I think," he said after a long pause, "we have more in common than I thought." Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was familiar, and it felt almost safe. Disaster never knocks. It just walks in and flips everything upside down. It began with a phone call at 6:17 a.m. William was already awake, as usual, sitting in his kitchen with a black coffee gone cold beside him. Snow dusted the windows, and the city outside was just beginning to stir. The voice on the other end of the line was tight, breathless legal counsel from Houston. "There's a problem with the Crestfield deal," the man said. "The zoning clearance was approved under the wrong ordinance. It's technically invalid." William didn't speak. He simply stood up and walked to the window. The phone pressed to his ear. "How big?" he asked. "A few million in permitting and land costs? Could go higher if litigation starts. How did this happen? Someone in compliance flagged it too late. We were moving fast." Of course they were. Everyone wanted to impress him. Everyone wanted to deliver ahead of schedule. And now, this. By 8:30 a.m., the 38th floor was in full damage control mode. Emails flew, phones rang, binders slammed. The boardroom filled with senior staff tight faces, nervous glances, shifting feet. William stood at the head of the table, eyes unreadable, voice clipped. "I trusted every one of you with this, and now I'm looking at millions of dollars in lost value because of a basic oversight." No one dared respond. Peter Lang sat stone-faced, hands folded, offering nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Then William turned to Grace, who had just handed him the latest draft of the legal review. "I need you to stay," he said curtly. "This doesn't leave your desk until every inch has been combed through. You'll coordinate with legal, accounting, and external counsel." She nodded, calm as ever. "Understood. You'll cancel the rest of your schedule." "I already have." There was no tone in her voice, no resentment, but something about her eyes caught him off guard. They were steady, but not warm. By noon, she was buried in documents, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting across spreadsheets. William noticed she hadn't taken a break, hadn't eaten, just worked. And he didn't stop her. At 7:43 p.m., he brought her a cup of coffee, set it down beside her with a quiet thud. She looked up, said "thank you," then turned back to the screen. Her shoulders were stiff, her fingers trembling slightly. He saw it, and still, he said nothing. By 11:30 p.m., the office was nearly empty, except for the glow of Grace's desk lamp and the dull hum of the building's heating system. William stepped out of his office and found her still at her post, highlighting a document with tired precision. "You should go home," he said finally. Grace looked up, eyes bloodshot. "I will. Once this section is clean." He hesitated. "You've done more than enough." She paused. "You asked me to stay until it was done." There was no anger in her voice, but there was something else, something heavier. "I didn't mean to," he began. "I know," she interrupted gently. "But you did." The sentence landed like a stone in his chest. It was the same tone she'd used weeks ago when he'd humiliated her in front of the boardroom. Not cruel, just honest. He stepped back, unsure what to say. But the silence between them said enough. She turned back to her screen, and he walked away into the hollowness of his own office, where regret settled over him like snow on a cold rooftop. The next morning, the board called an emergency meeting. William entered the room to find Lydia already seated, her expression unreadable. Peter Lang sat near the end of the table, looking far too calm. The chairman cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the situation with the Crestfield project. It's serious. Our investors are concerned." William nodded once. "I've taken steps to ensure damage control. Legal is involved. Grace Sullivan has already worked through all the documentation." "That's not the issue," Lydia interrupted. He turned toward her slowly. "The issue," she continued, "is that this isn't the first time something slipped through because people were too afraid to speak up. You lead with authority, William. But authority without collaboration becomes isolation." He narrowed his eyes. "You're suggesting this happened because of my leadership style, I'm saying," she replied evenly, "that perhaps it's time to reassess how you lead." Peter leaned forward slightly. "We're not asking for your resignation, just a temporary restructuring. Shared leadership for a quarter. Evaluate how decisions are made." The room fell silent. To William, it wasn't just a proposal, it was a verdict. A slow erosion of the empire he had built with nothing but grit and sleepless nights. He clenched his jaw, and for a moment, all he could hear was a memory. The sound of a suitcase being zipped, a door closing, a quiet kitchen where his ex-wife had once stood. I needed more than a partner in business. Now his company was saying the same thing. He looked up at Lydia, who once carried him on her back when their father was too drunk to notice. At Peter, who had stood beside him through the darkest early months of rebuilding. At the board, full of men and women who had watched him win but now wondered if he could still lead. And then he saw Grace. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, sitting at her desk, reviewing a contract, calm, still, unmoving. She didn't know he was watching, but for the first time, he wondered, what if she did? What if she saw this coming before any of us? Sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who cut the deepest. It was nearly midnight when Grace finally found the missing thread. The building had long since emptied out. Cleaning staff had made their quiet rounds. Lights dimmed on most floors, and the heating system hummed with its usual low rhythm. On the 38th floor, only one lamp still burned. She sat hunched over the corner table in the records room, surrounded by files, spreadsheets, and a flickering laptop screen. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in days. For the past 48 hours, the Crestfield disaster had consumed everyone. Legal teams scrambled, investors panicked, and the board leaned heavily toward pushing William into shared leadership. But none of it sat right with Grace. Too many things had happened too fast. The land deal had closed early. The zoning permits were too clean, and the data trail, well, it was just a little too tidy for a mistake. She followed her instinct, combing through archived file versions stored deep in the internal compliance system, documents even the legal team had overlooked. That's when she found it. A zoning approval file, dated 3 weeks before the deal closed. The original version included a flag highlighted by a junior compliance officer in Texas. The zoning code was in violation of the local ordinance, but that version had been altered, replaced, and the replacement. It bore the metadata of one person, Peter Lang. His digital fingerprint was unmistakable. Accessed under his credentials. Changed from his work terminal. Timed precisely during a window when William was out of the country. Grace stared at the screen, her heart slowing. It wasn't a clerical error, it was a calculated move, and it had been carefully constructed to make the oversight fall on her and her team. She printed the files, slipped them into a folder, then took the elevator up one floor to William's office. He was still there alone, standing in front of the massive window, arms crossed, staring out at the darkened skyline of Boston. The lights of the city blinked in quiet rhythm, reflecting off the thin frost forming along the glass. He didn't turn when she walked in, didn't speak. He must have heard the door open, but his silence was heavy, worn. Grace stepped forward slowly and placed the folder on his desk. "It was Peter," she said softly. "He altered the permit. William didn't move." "I found the original file in the backup archives," she continued. "It flagged the zoning issue. A compliance officer caught it, but the version was overwritten and the signature was his." Still, he didn't say anything, so she stepped beside him, speaking gently. "He left a trail. I don't think he expected anyone to look this deep." William closed his eyes, just for a moment, then finally asked, "Why?" She hesitated. To protect the deal, to rush it through, and maybe to set someone else up when it all came crashing down. "Me?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Me. My team. It would have made sense to blame us. We were closest to the paperwork, quiet, disposable." He opened his eyes and turned toward her slowly, like someone waking from a long, painful sleep. "I brought him in," he said, 12 years ago. "I promoted him when everyone told me not to. He helped me rebuild after the market collapse. I trusted him with things I've never even told my family." Grace didn't speak. I would have bet everything I had that he was loyal. Her voice was soft. "You did." That silence returned the one that wrapped around them like winter fog. It wasn't cold, not anymore. It was the silence of something being lost, something that had taken years to build, undone by one act of quiet betrayal. William walked to his desk, flipped open the folder, and scanned the documents. Every line confirmed what she said, every timestamp, every detail. Undeniable. But he didn't get angry. Not this time. "I'm not even surprised," he murmured. "Is that the worst part? That a piece of me expected this?" He sat down heavily, as if the weight of it had finally settled on his shoulders. Then he looked up at her, not as his assistant, but as the only person in the room who hadn't let him down. Grace met his eyes, calm, steady. "This isn't just about control anymore, William," she said. "It's about who you choose to be when everything falls apart." He blinked. The words hit deeper than any accusation ever could. They weren't meant to hurt. They were meant to wake something up, something he wasn't sure he still had. William stood up abruptly, reached for his coat, then stopped. His hands hung by his sides. Then, with a voice quieter than he intended, he asked, "Why are you still here?" Grace looked at him. "Because people who care don't leave just because it's hard." He didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, he walked past her through the door, into the hallway. No one knew where he was going, and for once, neither did he. But something in him whispered, "It's time to find out." Some healing doesn't happen in hospitals. It happens in silence, on cold sidewalks, under falling snow. The streets of Boston shimmered beneath a veil of freshly fallen snow, quiet and hushed, like a cathedral at midnight. The city, usually pulsing with noise and movement, had slowed to a stillness that felt almost sacred, William Hawthorne walked without direction, without purpose, really. He had left the office the night before with nothing but the cold in his chest and the silence in his ears. No phone, no coat warm enough for the weather. Just his thoughts, sharp, unforgiving, relentless. His polished shoes were soaked through within the hour. The leather had long lost its shine. Slush clung to the hem of his trousers. His hands, gloveless, had gone numb. Yet he kept walking. Past the closed cafes of Beacon Hill, past lampposts casting golden halos over the snow, past places he used to frequent before power became his only companion. His mind drifted uninvited to his mother. He hadn't thought about her in years, not since the last conversation they ever had. He had been just 15 when she left. One afternoon, she was home, folding laundry. The next morning, she was gone. No suitcase, no note, just absence. And then, weeks later, a phone call. He had dialed the number scrawled on the back of an old envelope, his fingers shaking, heart pounding. When she picked up, her voice had cracked. William. He had asked the question he never dared speak aloud before. Why did you leave? Her answer wasn't cruel. It wasn't bitter. It was quiet, almost ashamed. Because I thought you'd be better off learning to survive without me. He never called again. His father, a rigid and unyielding man, never spoke of her. He only told William the day he turned 16. People will always leave. You build walls, not doors. Remember that. So he did. He built walls out of money, power, control. He didn't let anyone in, not really. Even his marriage had felt like a business contract. Until she, too, walked out. And now, Peter, who had stood beside him for 12 years, who had toasted his wins, traveled across states with him, defended him at shareholder meetings. Peter, who had stabbed him in the back with a pen stroke. The betrayal didn't enrage him, not in the way it once might have. No, this time, it emptied him. William sank onto a bench near the Charles River. Snow coated its wooden slats. He didn't care. His coat was soaked anyway. Above him, the sky lightened into soft gray, the kind of dawn only winter knows, cold, slow, and quiet as breath. He closed his eyes and listened to the river, let the wind sting his skin, let the numbness melt into something else, something close to feeling. It was the first time in years he had been still without performing stillness. And then, as the sky blushed with light, he stood up, his legs aching, and began the long walk back. The office was nearly empty when he arrived. Only the cleaning crew lingered on the lower floors. A few early risers, coffee in hand, blinked in surprise as he passed by without his usual brisk nod or cold stare. But on the 38th floor, one light was on. Her light. Grace sat at her desk, a fresh mug of tea steaming beside her, flipping through a set of printed documents. Her coat still hung neatly on the back of her chair. She had clearly been there all night. She looked up as he stepped into view. No surprise in her expression, only quiet recognition. He stopped a few feet away, snow melting into the carpet beneath his shoes. I walked, he said simply. She nodded, not asking where. All night, he added. Grace tilted her head slightly. Did it help? He let out a slow breath. Yes and no. She didn't press. I thought about a lot of things, he said. About Peter, about trust, about who I've become. Still, she said nothing. I owe you an apology. Her brow lifted. Just a little. For what? For letting you get caught in this storm? For not seeing clearly? For he hesitated, using silence the way others use anger. He looked at her, really looked. Her calm face, her quiet presence, the steadiness he had leaned on without even realizing it. "I'm sorry, Grace." For a moment, she didn't respond. The silence stretched gentle, not cold. Then she said softly, "I'm not here for an apology. William." He blinked. "I'm here because I believe people can change, but not everyone chooses to." She leaned forward slightly, her voice even. "So, what do you want to do now?" There it was, the question. Not how will you fix it, not who will you blame, but what do you want to do now? It disarmed him more than her silence ever had. He felt something strange in his chest, like thawing, like beginning. William smiled, not the practiced smile of boardrooms and press releases. A real one, quiet, a little tired, but entirely his. "I think," he said slowly, "I want to start over." She didn't say anything, but for the first time, she smiled too. And outside, the snow kept falling. Letting go is not weakness. Sometimes, it's the strongest thing you can do. By mid-morning, the snow had slowed to a gentle dusting, and the city stirred back to life beneath a blanket of white. But up on the 38th floor of the Hawthorne group, something else was shifting quietly, but profoundly. William had changed into a dry suit. His expression was calm but focused. There was no trace of the storm from the night before, only the quiet clarity that often followed a breaking point. Lydia stood across from him in his office, arms crossed, brow furrowed. "You're serious about this?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes. You're stepping down, voluntarily, temporarily," he clarified. "I need space to rebuild, not the company myself." Lydia studied him with the shrewdness of an older sister who'd known him through every stage of his life, from scraped knees to boardroom wars. She didn't look convinced, but something in his eyes made her pause. "I've never seen you like this," she said finally. William managed a small smile. "That's because I've never been like this." She glanced toward the hallway where Grace's desk sat just outside. Her lips curved slightly, knowingly. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain secretary, would it? William didn't answer, but the silence spoke enough. With a sigh, Lydia turned back toward him and held out her hand. "All right, I'll take the reins while you step back. But if I find one skeleton in one closet, I'm cleaning house with a flamethrower." He chuckled. "Deal." That afternoon, Peter Lang was called into the boardroom. The documents Grace had uncovered were laid bare. No theatrics, no denial, just quiet resignation and the unmistakable fall of a man who had gambled on power and lost everything. The board moved swiftly, a formal dismissal. No press, no scandal, just erasure. William stood by the window as Peter exited the building for the last time. His coat pulled tight against the wind. He didn't feel vindicated, only relieved. It was over. But something else was just beginning. Later that day, William called a full board meeting. The conference room filled quickly: executives, directors, legal staff. Grace sat quietly near the end of the table, her notepad in front of her, like always. But this time, she wasn't there to take notes. She was part of the meeting. "I'd like to propose something new," William began, standing at the head of the table. His tone was even, measured. But there was an edge of quiet passion that hadn't been there before. "We've spent decades building wealth, expanding property, reshaping skylines. But we've forgotten something." He paused, glancing at Grace, then back at the room. "We forgot why cities matter, why people matter. Homes aren't just investments. They're sanctuaries, and far too many people in this city don't have one." A murmur moved through the room, I want to establish a housing support foundation privately funded by the company, aimed at helping low-income families stay in their homes, especially through winter. Especially now. He turned again, this time fully facing Grace. And I want Grace Sullivan to lead it. You could have heard a pin drop. Some blinked. Others exchanged glances. A few board members shifted in their seats, uncertain how to respond. Grace herself sat still. Only her eyes widened slightly. She's proven herself more than capable. William continued, she's meticulous, strategic, and she has the one thing I've lacked for a long time, compassion, rooted in clarity. Lydia leaned forward from her seat and added, I support this, wholeheartedly. That did it. Hands were raised, questions asked, but the tide had already turned. Within 30 minutes, the proposal was approved. And, just like that, Grace Sullivan was no longer a secretary. She was now the director of the Hawthorne Housing Initiative. When the meeting adjourned, people filed out slowly, still adjusting to the shift. Grace remained seated, her notepad untouched. William approached her gently. Are you all right? He asked. She looked up at him, eyes shining, not with shock, but something gentler, something steadier. I didn't see this coming, she said softly. I did, he replied. From the moment you handed me that cup of tea. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her really smile. Not a polite expression, not a courteous lift of the lips, an actual full smile. Warm, radiant, real. I was going to wait until tomorrow, he said, clearing his throat. But maybe tonight's better. For what? He hesitated, then tried not to overthink it. Dinner. Grace tilted her head. Dinner. Just dinner, he said. No boardrooms, no crisis, no walls. She smiled again, softer this time. I'd like that. They stood for a moment, neither rushing to fill the silence. Outside, the snow had picked up again, brushing against the windows like tiny hands tapping for attention. In the stillness, two people, one just learning how to feel, the other learning how to trust again, shared something that didn't need words. The first crack of something real. Real power is not about raising your voice. It's about being heard without shouting. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were no grand speeches, no press releases, no official memos. But something at the Hawthorne Group was changing, and it began with the man who used to make the whole building fall silent with a glance. William started showing up to meetings, not just to talk, but to listen. He didn't interrupt anymore. He asked questions, real questions, not ones designed to catch people off guard, but ones that invited answers. That built trust. When someone spoke, he made eye contact. When someone struggled, he asked how he could help. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was felt in every corner of the company. Meanwhile, on the newly dedicated 20th floor, Grace was building something of her own. The Hawthorne Housing Initiative had started as a passion project, but it was quickly becoming something much larger. Grace assembled a small team, a former social worker named Laura, an urban planner named Dean, and a tech specialist named Erin, who'd once been unhoused herself. Their mission was clear: provide emergency housing assistance for struggling families across Boston. Fast, direct, no red tape. Grace led the team with quiet confidence. She wasn't the type to bark orders or draw attention, but her clarity, empathy, and steady expectations created a space where people wanted to do their best. She had a gift for seeing people, not just their resumes or roles, but their worries, their potential, their hearts. And William noticed. He found reasons to stop by the initiative's floor, always under the guise of checking in, offering support, reviewing budgets. But sometimes he just sat in the back of the room during planning sessions, watching how Grace navigated conflict without blame. how she asked for input, then made firm, thoughtful decisions. It fascinated him, inspired him, made him wonder what other parts of life he'd missed by chasing control. One Friday afternoon, as a soft drizzle tapped against the windows, the two departments gathered for a cross-functional briefing. William stood at the front of the room, presenting the company's new winter relief strategy, a collaborative plan involving both corporate resources and the housing initiative's reach. The room was full, warm with energy. Grace sat near the front, taking notes, occasionally chiming in with thoughtful suggestions. Halfway through the presentation, William paused beside her chair to make a point. Without thinking, without planning, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. It was brief, light, natural, but it lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met. He didn't say a word, neither did she, but something passed between them, something quiet and unmistakably real. The room stayed focused, but a few sets of eyes caught the gesture. Laura noticed. Lydia, standing near the back, arched an eyebrow. A young associate nudged her colleague with a barely hidden grin. By Monday morning, the whispers had begun. They weren't cruel, just curious. Have you noticed how often Hawthorne stops by the housing office? Did he just smile at the staff meeting? Grace was at his table during the quarterly lunch, but neither William nor Grace addressed it. They didn't deny it. They didn't explain it. They just kept working. The change was evident, though everywhere. William's once tightly sealed door was now often ajar. People laughed in meetings again. Initiatives got green-lit, not because they guaranteed profit, but because they held promise. And the board, once skeptical, began to see the impact in real time. Employee retention improved, public perception warmed, and, for the first time in years, the Hawthorne Group felt human. One evening, as the office emptied out and the elevators chimed their soft lullaby, Grace remained at her desk, sorting through applications from a single mother facing eviction and a veteran with PTSD looking for transitional housing. William appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "You've created something incredible here," he said quietly. Grace looked up, her expression soft. "I didn't do it alone." He nodded, handing her a cup. They stood there in companionable silence, the kind that didn't demand to be filled, the kind that only existed between 2 people who had earned each other's trust the hard way. There was still work ahead, still healing to be done. Still unspoken things between them, but for now, this was enough. Every empire needs a foundation, and sometimes love is the only one strong enough. It began with a single family, a mother of 2, eviction notice pinned to the peeling paint of their apartment door. 2 weeks away from homelessness, no place to go, no one left to call. But then the initiative stepped in. Within 48 hours, the family had a warm apartment, stocked kitchen, and a caseworker walking beside them every step of the way. It wasn't just housing, it was hope. The story caught fire. Local news picked it up first. Then, national outlets. Corporate giant launches. Quiet revolution in affordable housing. One headline read, "Photos of families smiling in their new homes began circulating online, followed by interviews with caseworkers, grateful parents, and volunteers." And somewhere in the center of it all, Grace Sullivan. People wanted to know more about the woman behind the mission. Interview requests flooded in. Morning shows, magazines, even a feature for Forbes women to watch. But she turned every one of them down. "I'm not the story," she said to Lydia one afternoon, folding yet another letter from a grateful tenant. "I'm just someone walking beside the people who are—" Lydia had smiled quietly. That's exactly why people want to hear from you. Still. Grace remained in the background, her place of comfort, letting the work speak for itself. But not everyone was comfortable letting things go unsaid. It came in a plain envelope. No return address. Just her name in familiar handwriting. Grace found it on her desk late one evening after the others had gone home. The city outside her window was wrapped in early winter silence, lights blurred behind streaks of snow. She turned the envelope over in her hands for a moment, hesitant, curious. Then she opened it. It wasn't long, just a page and a half, ink on textured paper. But it stopped her world. Grace, there are things I should have said out loud. Maybe I wasn't ready then, or maybe I was afraid that once I did, something in me would shift forever. Thank you, not just for what you've built, but for how you've stayed. Through silence, through storms, through all the versions of me you didn't owe a second chance. You've reminded me what real power looks like. It's not in towers or titles or headlines. It's in kindness that doesn't keep score, in quiet loyalty, in love that waits without pushing. You've changed me, Grace, not with speeches, but with steady presence. If this is more than friendship for you too, then I'll be here. Door open, light on, waiting. William, her hands trembled as she folded the letter back into its envelope. Not because of fear, but because of the overwhelming weight of being seen. Truly seen. No one had ever written to her like that. No one had ever meant it. She grabbed her coat. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes drifting through the Boston sky like tiny pieces of Grace itself. The streets were quiet, muffled under layers of white. Her boots crunched softly along the sidewalk as she made her way to his building. She didn't stop to rehearse what she'd say. Didn't need to. When she reached his door, she paused for only a moment before knocking. Just once. A few seconds passed. Then it opened, and there he stood, in a sweater, no tie, no mask. Just William. His eyes searched hers, and for the first time, they both let their guards fall. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He stepped aside, and she walked in. Some people build empires of steel and glass. Others build empires of kindness. It had been exactly 1 year. 1 year since the cold night when Grace had knocked on William's door with snow in her hair and tears in her eyes. 1 year since he let her in, not just into his apartment, but into the quietest, most guarded corners of his life. In that year, everything had changed, and nothing important had been lost. The Hawthorne Housing Initiative had grown from a floor in Boston to a national movement. 6 major cities had launched partnership programs. Nearly 5,000 families had found housing, job assistance, or access to mental health services. Volunteers poured in from across the country. Donations followed, not because of marketing, but because people believed. They believed in something rare, in a company that led with compassion, in a CEO who had chosen transformation over tradition, in a woman who never asked for credit, but quietly changed everything. Grace never liked the spotlight. Even now, with her title upgraded to Director of Strategic Impact, she still arrived early, stayed late, and kept her phone set to silent. The press wanted her story, but she told them, gently, it's not about me. It never was. She turned down features, declined awards. Instead, she kept her focus on the families, on the single mothers balancing 2 jobs, the veterans seeking dignity, the young people aging out of foster care who just needed someone to believe in them. She saw herself in all of them. And she knew what it meant to survive in silence. William had changed too. His sharp edges remained but softened with purpose. He still made difficult decisions, still signed off on million-dollar strategies. But he also sat in round-table meetings with tenants, attended community dinners, learned the names of every person working at the initiative, even the janitorial staff. The man who once ruled from the top floor now walked the halls like he belonged among them. People noticed, they stopped fearing him, started trusting him, and for William, that shift, being trusted instead of obeyed, felt like the real legacy. Peter Lang had been dismissed quietly 6 months ago. No press, no scandal. Just a firm internal statement about integrity, followed by restructuring. Lydia had stepped into a broader leadership role, working closely with Grace, forming a bond neither of them had expected. "She's changed you," Lydia said to William one day after a board meeting, "and I don't just mean your calendar habits." He smiled. "She reminded me I could change it all." The day of the summit came with a clear sky and a quiet kind of expectation. The ballroom at the Hyatt was filled with over 300 guests, nonprofit leaders, city officials, CEOs, and curious citizens from all over the country. They had come not just to hear about the Hawthorne Group's success, but to understand the how a company known for ruthless efficiency had become a symbol of corporate compassion. William stood at the podium, dressed simply. No tie, no script. Grace stood to the side, clipboard in hand, eyes steady. For 40 minutes, William spoke with calm clarity about systems, partnerships, and outcomes, but as the session opened for questions, a hand rose from the back. It belonged to a woman middle-aged, perhaps mid-50s. She held no badge, wore no suit, just a soft scarf and eyes that seemed to hold her own collection of scars. "Mr. Hawthorne," she asked, "if you don't mind me asking, what changed you?" The room quieted. William looked down for a moment. Then he looked at Grace. She didn't speak. She didn't nod, but her presence was an answer all its own. He turned back to the crowd and said softly, "Someone once told me that no one is too far gone to begin again." He let the words settle. "She reminded me that power doesn't mean fear, it means service. She reminded me that silence can heal, that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is choose to stay when they could walk away." A hush swept the room. Then applause. Not thunderous, but full, real. The kind of applause that speaks not of admiration, but of understanding. After the summit, people lingered in clusters. Some took photos, others wiped their eyes. A few even asked Grace for her autograph, not because she was famous, but because they felt seen by her story. But William and Grace quietly stepped out the side door, leaving the fanfare behind. Outside, the autumn light was fading into gold. Leaves skittered along the sidewalk like whispers. They walked side by side, saying nothing, until William reached for her hand. Grace paused, then intertwined her fingers with his. And there, in full view of the world, not hidden, not rushed, they walked forward, together, not as boss and assistant, not as savior and survivor, but as two people who had chosen daily, quietly, to rebuild their lives from the inside out. People talk about empires, of glass and steel, of numbers and names, of fear and control. But the greatest empire William Hawthorne ever built was made of kindness, and Grace Sullivan, his compass, his quiet storm, his beginning again, had been its foundation all along. There comes a time in life when success stops being about what we've built and starts being about who we've become. William Hawthorne had power, prestige, and a towering empire, but none of it could heal the quiet ache of loneliness or the walls he'd built to protect himself from feeling. It wasn't until he met someone who saw past his titles and into his soul that he began to rediscover something he thought he had lost forever: his humanity. This story reminds us that kindness is never wasted, that even the coldest hearts can learn to soften, and that change is always possible. No matter how late it seems, we all carry wounds the world cannot see. Sometimes it takes just one gentle voice, one act of grace, to remind us of who we truly are. You're never too old to begin again. And you're never too far gone to choose love over fear. So perhaps the real success in life isn't measured by what we conquer, but by what we're willing to open our hearts to. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in a small way, we're deeply grateful. Stories like this are meant to be shared. So if you believe in the power of compassion, healing, and second chances, please consider giving this video a like, sharing it with someone you care about, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that matter. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself, and never stop believing in the beauty of new beginnings.